introduction, John. It's a pleasure. I see John over at our roundtable, so talking to him, I say, hey, this is kind of near and dear to my heart. I actually grew up right nearby it, and it's not something that you hear about, especially here in northern Alabama, southern Tennessee, or any other Western theater. So it's a good piece of gear. Plus, it's also a great trivia question. If anybody ever asks you what's the last land battle in the Civil War, you're like, Palmetto Ranch or Palmetto Hill. All right, and so I'll start off with that. So is it Palmetto Ranch or Palmetto Hill? Palmetto like a palm tree. I call it Palmetto Ranch because the hill, you can actually see it right here. It's probably about 15, 20 feet high. Not much of a hill. You know what I mean? Actually, it's called a loma in Spanish. It's just a small depression that the coyotes can go up there to look for predators. You know what I mean? So it's more of a ranch. So think of a working farm ranch area. And that's flat plain, and that comes into play with the actual battle itself. All right. If I can get the next slide when you're ready. Sorry. Look at this. It's 2 days, May 12th and May 13th, 1865. We just had a discussion earlier about Lee surrendering in April 1865. What's in May? What's going on here? And we'll get into that a little bit. So this is me. I'm actually a Texas native. This battle actually occurred right nearby where my house is. And I found out later on that my distant family actually owns the land that it's still on. And I actually just found that out recently, so it's kind of neat, but pretty neat. All right, so I'm a Texas native by trade. I went to the Naval Academy. There's a history major up there. I joined the Marine Corps. I flew helicopters, retired from the Marine Corps about 4 years ago, and moved here to Huntsville. So I've lived here in Huntsville about 4.5 years, and we absolutely love it here. My wife and I love it. She's from Eastern Maryland, which is very conservative. I'm from Texas. I'm very conservative. Alabama's a great place. Texas is slowly taking over in regards to Buc-ee's, Whataburger, you know what I mean? But we both are very conservative. We have Second Amendment bonds that I love, and that's why I love living here. The rest of my family still live in Texas all the time. They keep asking me to go back, but I'm in no rush. Plus, it's got a lot of green, and Texas is more brown than most places, okay? All right, so next slide. So also, like what John said too, I'm just a tech guy at the Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable. I'm not a professional historian, and this is a hobby, and this is something I love. So this is what we're going to talk about. Why in May 12 and 13? We know April 1865, right? Great book, great movies, miniseries, and everything, where you talk about all the stuff that happened. Appomattox, of course, everyone thinks, Lee surrendered Appomattox, that was the end of the war. Well, Lee only surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. And if you look on the size comparison of the amount of men who were surrendered, he's actually, he's not really that high up there. Bennett's Place actually had almost 90,000 men in North Carolina. That was the largest surrender of an army with Joe Johnston there. And that happened in 17 days. Okay. Citronelle, right here, Alabama, Mississippi, and eastern Louisiana. General Taylor surrendered right here, here in Alabama, down south over there. Still 25 days later. But you get the idea. Lee was the heart of the Confederacy. He was the icon. When you think of the Confederacy, you don't think of Jefferson Davis, you think of Lee, right? And Lee was a very well-respected general, so when he surrendered, it's like the writing's on the wall. We're not going to be able to pull this together, right? But if you look at Palmetto Ranch, 33 days after Lee surrendered. So when I grew up, this is what I was told. I'm going to squash this rumor right now. I was told that it took a long time for news to travel from Appomattox in eastern Virginia all the way to South Texas. And I'm going to tell you right now, that's not true. When Lee surrendered, right, back on April 9th, Houston newspaper headlines were already detailing it April 10th. The transatlantic cable, which you could talk to London, right, was not working at the time. So with ship travel from New York and ports east going out to London, they found out about it 10 to 12 days later. Vermont, running newspaper headlines 9 days later. So it's not true. Maybe this was revolutionary time, perhaps, or pre-telegraph, perhaps, but that's not true. And you'll see why. Why did we fight a major land battle in the midst of all those surrenders 33 days? That doesn't make sense, right? And you'll see what came of it and why is that unique. Okay, next slide. So for orientation, Eastern, Western theaters, TransMississippi, And if you were in the Union, they actually had the Far West Theater, they refer to that as. Confederacy typically did TransMississippi from Mississippi all the way out west, and they lumped it over into one theater.
That's a good picture. Yeah, good picture.
Yeah, it's a good, nice physical breakdown where you're looking at. Obviously, towards the end of the war, which would battle Papua and Palomino Ranch, General Edmund Kirby Smith was the commanding general of the Trans-Mississippi area. He was in charge of all of it, right? So when Vicksburg fell, right, no longer anything over here, everything else, Chattanooga, everything was falling over here, he was actually pretty well cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. So he had a lot of autonomy. He could do what he wanted. Does anyone know that Missouri was the number 3 ranked number of battles in the Civil War? Virginia, then Tennessee, and Missouri, right? And that happens in his AO. But this guy is in charge of everything. He's cut off from Richmond. He's operating by himself. And guess what he also doesn't have? Money. He has no money. So how do you do this, right? So you have General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Louisiana. You got Mr. Magruder, General Magruder. And then you have Walker, Texas Ranger. Not Texas Ranger. But General Walker in charge of the Army of Texas. Towards the end of the war. These guys always shuffled around a little bit, but this is where it was when I bring you back to May of 1865. All right?
Yeah.
Next slide. And if I'm talking, you guys have a question on it, just chime in. I'll start talking fast. I was a pilot. I think I have ADD, you know what I mean? And I'm used to talking fast, so bear with me. Texas, right? My homeland, my motherland, as you can see. We're going to concentrate on this section right here, which is called the lower Rio Grande Valley, Rio Grande River and a valley. There's no mountains, so it's not a valley like the Tennessee Valley. It's just a floodplain, really. But valley is a very lucrative term to entice people to come join you, right? A valley, Shenandoah Valley, beautiful, right? No, flat plains and flooding areas for the Rio Grande River.
Okay, Steve, is that okay?
Can you guys see? Okay. We're going to concentrate on this one. Up here is take this and pull it up to here so we can see. Corpus Christi, I'm going to point out some major landmarks. Corpus Christi. And then here's the mouth of the Rio Grande River, obviously, U.S. and Mexico. And then over here, you see Rio Grande City. And what you can see way up here is Laredo. Laredo makes the western confines. So that is the area that we're going to be concentrating on as we go along. Next slide, please, Lee. This is a very unique area. This is not, I'm from South Texas. I always tell people I'm from South Texas instead of regular Texas. Because it's different, geographically different. Everything is slightly unique. If you think South Texas, you think San Antonio, and you're correct, San Antonio is kind of about up here. But this is interesting. So we have 1821 Mexican independence from Spain, Constitution of 1824 signed. This is a real quick history, y'all. If you see the Mexican flag that says 1824, it was signed after the Constitution of 1824. This was actually what brought in a lot of the Anglo settlers from America. This whole area was slam-packed with Comanches and a lot of very angry Indians, and it's very sparse and it's kind of a rough piece of land. So Mexico they couldn't produce people fast enough, so they opened it up to Anglo settlers to come in. Stephen F. Austin, you may have heard, right? He's capital Texas. Yep. He was the father that brought a lot of anglers in. He's from Virginia, I believe. He brought a lot of people in. Now, according to 1824, all they had to do, they had to pay taxes to the Mexican government. They had to convert to Catholicism, and they were given a whole bunch of land. And they were also given their own arms, kind of like if you think of American Revolution and militia, where you could guard your own town from Indians and things like that. So pretty cool. What that was, when you tell people free land, people flooded the area. If you wanted a new life, away from whatever, get away from your in-laws, whatever it may be, you could go to Texas and get a whole bunch of land. So it started booming. They didn't like some of the things the Mexican government started doing, and that's when we actually revolted, right? Texas independence from Mexico. Remember the Alamo, right? Texas fought, and in 1836 became its own country for 9 years. 1836 to 1845 was its own country. Well, still, this area, South Texas, that we're concentrating on today, very autonomous in what they did. Old school. It's kind of like, I really don't. If I live out in a rural area, Washington, D.C., kind of applies to me, kind of doesn't. I'm more concerned about locally. You are so far removed from Washington, D.C., right? So these people had a spirit of independence. In fact, they even tried to do the Republic of the Rio Grande, they tried, and to do part of Texas and Mexico. When we think of U.S. and Mexico, we think of a border. You don't cross the border, there's legal, ramifications, you just don't do that.
Yeah.
But back in these days, the border was very fluid. The people that lived here, some of their land went across the river. They had family on both sides. It was very nebulous, all right? So they tried to do it, and then it was actually shut down by the Mexican government. And here's actually the flag, the red, white, and black. Kind of pulled away as a little bit of history and trivia. But whatever it was. 1845, Texas joined the Union, right? A couple main reasons why Texas joined the Union. Why would Texas join the Union, right? One, it had a crippling load of debt. And then secondly, this is interesting, they couldn't control the border. So they went to the United States to join to get border control. Do we see that nowadays in 2021? Yeah, right?
I hate to say.
So now Texas currently is trying to fund its own border wall because the U.S. government has failed, but that was part of it. But that's why Texas actually joined the Union. That's pretty neat, right? And plus, Texas did not have the manpower to put soldiers, rangers, or any other forces along the border to keep. Now, here's the deal. They didn't care about settlers going across. They cared about bandits, criminals, and lawyers, right? If only they had a wall, right, or something like that. We would have said, right? Might be a little different. Okay, next slide.
Westward
Right.
expansion.
Say again?
Westward expansion.
Yeah. So this is kind of what we're going to go over. Don't worry about too much like this. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the topography of that area. And you guys never been there? This is
No.
this is not 1865. This is Google Maps 2020, right? So here we go. But you can see it here, Gulf of Mexico. Here, you can see these huge, massive lakes. It's kind of a natural floodplain. This thing, it rains a lot. It comes in. The river flows, overgoes the borders, and comes across in all this area. You can't farm too well here. There are certain plots that you can do, and it's typically from here, going this way, you can farm. Here, all the way up to here on this side, you can't plant stuff. It's marshy, it's salty, everything. But cows love it because it grows grass like it's cool, and cows just grass all day, and they're tough and indestructible, right? So a lot of ranches and cattle land and more fields over there, all right? Matamoros, border town you guys might have heard of, right? Maybe a little bit.
Brownsville.
Right next to Brownsville, Texas, the southern tip of Texas and the southern border of the United States, right? Okay, well, at the time, Brownsville wasn't necessarily too big, but Matamoros in 1865 was a major hub. So I'll get into that a little bit more as we go. But if you were to think of a major trade, okay, so let me ask you a question. Everyone thinks Atlanta, right? Sherman goes to Atlanta, burns Atlanta, takes it. It's a strategic battle. Do you guys know the population of Atlanta in 1864? Have you guys been to Boaz? Have you guys ever been to Boaz?
I've read it, I can't remember.
It had the same population that Boaz has now. Just a little less than 10,000 people. It was the 99th largest city in the in the country, right?
99th.
99th. It was tied 99th. Second, obviously, New Orleans was the largest, then Baltimore, Boston, and then Mobile was the largest in Alabama. Just FYI at the time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But Matamoros was an international piece of hub. Now you go down there, it's kind of shady, dirty border town, you know what I mean? Everything. But in 1865, this was the New York City of the West when it came to culture, traditions, law, and then trade. And trade's the big one that we're going to get into in a little bit. But you can see it. So I put in here red. That's not Charlton Heston and the Nile River. That is the Rio Grande River, just so you guys can see it in the back.
I've read several Western books in history. It mentions Matamoros a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's kind of something. But again, Corpus Christi is up here. Here's the mouth of the Rio Grande.
Oh, yeah.
Way out there is Laredo. And then one thing I do want to point out while I got here is, you guys may have heard South Padre Island, vacation spots, spring break, and everything like that. Yep, and it comes down here, and then this goes into the Laguna Madre, right? The Mother Lagoon, if you translate it here. And here is Port Isabel now. It used to be Point Isabel. Disregard this long line. This long line exists now. It did not exist in 1865. This is a man-made shipping channel. You guys know the USS Ranger aircraft carrier. They would sail around when it's done, and they pull it into here, and then they rip it apart and make it into scraps, razor blades, and decommission it here at the port of Brownsville. So even though Brownsville has a port, it's pretty far away from the ocean. It's got a waterway to get in there. Okay, next slide. All right. Imagine me standing near the mouth of the Rio Grande River, looking north. You can see over here, this is South Padre Island. And you can see this man-made improved jetty for shipping. At the time, the jetty was not there, but this inlet was. So this island that you see right here was called Brazo Santiago. You might see that in some of the others, but this was where the Union Army, for the most part, camped to control that area. Okay, next slide. This is today's mouth of the Rio Grande River. Gulf of Mexico on the left, coming inland here. 1865, this was not. It's been dammed up, Falcon Dam and lakes and everything way upstream, so it's been throttled back, you know what I mean? Whereas the Tennessee River got wider and bigger, this one actually got smaller.
Yeah, a lot of fishermen and women go up there too.
Yeah, and so this little sandbar was gone because there was so much water going out. So you can put cargo on ships up and sail right down the Rio Grande, right into the Gulf of Mexico, and then put it on other ships. And that's what they would typically do. Due to the small draft here, all the ships would anchor off the coast, and then ships would ferry back and forth, and then light put cargo. It's actually called lighters. Small sailboats and other boats you can get a hold of, or steamboats. Next slide. This is Point Isabel, which I'll get into in a little bit. And then obviously you see South Padre Island here, and then the Gulf of Mexico. I know I'm kind of throwing you around. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Sorry.
We're going to Dr. Pacer. Watch out.
I got my Bluetooth hearing aids. I'm good.
It's all good. Yeah.
I was
All right.
captivated by the picture.
Oh yeah. So this, so obviously, you're not here to listen about the Mexican War. I got it. But you kind of need to know there's a lot of learned things from the Mexican War that come into play in 1865 at the Battle of Palmito Ranch. This is not the Rio Grande Valley. You can see the mountains in the back. This is probably down in Monterrey, Mexico. But it's pretty cool. Okay, next slide. All right. I've already mentioned this is where we're at, so we're still in the Mexican War. So let's set the stage for what we're going to do with Palmito Ranch. So, in April 25th, 1846, there was a large debate. When Texas joined the Union, nobody really knew exactly where the border was between America and Mexico. Texans claimed it was the Rio Grande River. Mexicans claimed it was over there up near Corpus Christi. So this contested land, everyone just kind of ignored for a while. Well, when Mr. Polk from Columbia, Tennessee was president, he's like, no, you join the Union, we get every bit of land. This is ours. And Mexico's like, not really. The Treaty of Guadalupe did not really specify. It was very vague. And Polk's like, I got a lot of soldiers, it's ours. And they're like, what? And yes, they did. So Zachary Taylor, who actually later on became president, right, got sent on a force. He came over here to Point Isabel, and this is where he started stockpiling his force. Look at that. It's within a stone's throw from the Rio Grande River. How do you exert power, and how do you tell internationally that you own that land? You put troops on it, and that's what they did, right? So they're like, okay, interesting. So they start thinking, okay, hey, let's go ahead and, where else? So there's the big city of Matamoros, right? How can we really tell them that we own this place? We'll put a fort right there. So they built a fort right here. It was called Fort Texas at the time, and they built it right there. I mean, it was a good, nice one. Parapet, 15 feet high, 15 feet deep, trenches, and it had about 8 guns. So very good way to say, this is our land, right? And thumb your nose at the capital there, or at the city of Matamoros. So Mexicans are like, okay, it's on. We're gonna do this. So some reports came back that the Mexicans were starting to come around, and they said, okay, great. So Zach Taylor sent a force out there with next slide. With 2 companies of dragoons, about 80 guys. And they came out here led by Captain Seth Thornton. And they came over here and they were actually ambushed. In fact, you know Captain Seth Thornton's second in command with us, this guy named William Hardy. I think we know who that guy is. Yeah, he got ambushed. Hardy and Thornton and all those guys were taken as POWs into Mexico. Wow. And they were ambushed by like 1,500 Mexicans. So you want to talk about cavalry, falling apart. How did 80 dragoons not notice a force of over 1,600 Mexicans with bright colors and everything like that? Well, they hit and they got them, right? But this is the area right nearby. You can see a little bit of the ground in the back. It looks white because they do grow cotton down there, you know, and they just farm that field. But this, so now, when U.S. forces were ambushed on American soil, Polk just walked over to Congress and go, our soldiers were attacked on American soil. It's time for some war.
Yeah.
And Congress was like, okay, it is war. And that's how the Mexican War kicked off, right in this area. Okay, next slide.
Huh.
So again, just about 23 miles away, just about another 22 miles, so you can kind of figure it out, right? Fairly easy navigable, decent roads, dirt roads and stuff like that, good on horses to get by. Regardless, we're at war now. So Taylor says, hey, I'm gonna go back and I gotta hold this because my supplies are coming in to Point Isabel, right? So he left to go start securing these lines. He's gotta maintain these lines or he's gonna get, because he's on a frontier, he's operating by himself, right? So he goes over here, and May 3rd, next slide, the Mexicans here at Matamoros decide, you know what, we don't like this Fort Brown, or this Fort Texas. So they start shooting it from across the river into Fort Texas, right? And during that melee, this other guy, his name Braxton Bragg, was actually there during the bombardment. You know what I mean? But at the time, one guy died, Major John Brown. So the fort became Fort Brown, and then the city, which was starting to boom up, right, became Brownsville, Texas. That's how you get the name. Okay, next slide.
Hey, Mom, I'm sorry, where's the fort actually located there?
Right here.
Right there.
Yep,
Right?
and these were the cannon positions
Yeah,
shooting from across the river.
thing. Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
Okay, next slide.
I got you.
So then they're like, okay, now you bombard our fort. You know what I mean? This is not good. So Zach Taylor comes north, starts pulling his men down. Mexican forces actually cross the river and they come up here to this area and actually where they engage him for the Mexican War. Next slide. This is the first troop on troop contact to battle Palo Alto. And you can see the terrain, flat scrub, some inundating little small rivets and hills. Kind of tough for men to march. It's not like your front yard. There's little divots, but it's okay for horses and you can do that, right?
Yeah, they had some of that grass that could cut your legs through your pants and stuff.
Some of the area you can see, this is a mesquite tree, which is thorny. Just like a lot of stuff in there is thorny and not too friendly, but oh well. The good news is that it's flat and you can see, right? Okay, so they have the Battle of Palo Alto. Mexicans dropped their troops over a mile-long front. That's how many troops the Mexicans had. And the U.S. troops said, hey, you know what? We can't do a bayonet charge, which was very common back in those days. How you fight a war, right? 1846. This is what you do, right? No big deal. Pikes and even bayonets, right? So they're like, okay. And they said, forget it. We can't do that. This is a mile wide. So we're gonna have to do some tactics, right? And this guy right here, Major Ringgold, he actually brings up this flying artillery, which is smaller, lighter cannon that they can wheel out, turn around, shoot, and then advance and move, right? Whereas the Mexicans had big, huge, beautiful, ornate cannons that could not move. They couldn't move. You required a wagon team. Once they're in place, they're in place. And then Major Ringgold, right, who kind of brought out this idea, actually got killed in the battle. So you get from Maryland by Maryland. They talk about there's an ode in I think the fourth stanza in regards to Major Ringgold. In fact, there's a fort. The U.S. actually makes a fort in his honor over there as well.
I read a story about that Palo Alto battle, and they're talking about. You mentioned the artillery. That was I think the first time in history where they used portable artillery batteries and moving them around.
Yep.
Light artillery.
Yeah, flying artillery. Now, there's a reason why I mentioned that here before we go to fast forward to 1865. Okay, next slide. So they're here, they drove the Mexicans south, they pursued, okay, next slide, and they get to this place here, which is, there you go, Battle over Sacadala, right? And this is where it was a pretty good engagement. The Mexicans were already to run, it was kind of no big deal. They shot them up, they used the flying artillery one more time, pushed them over. And at that point, the Mexicans fled across the river, went back to Mexico. So then, hurrah, hurrah, we pushed the invaders out of the United States. Right? And you know, I've been to Resaca, Georgia.
Oh yeah.
It's named after this battlefield, or this battle in the Mexican War. Okay, next slide. That's it. I'm not going to talk any more about the Mexican War, I promise you, right? Because then it goes down to Mexico, and that's when, you know, all of our guys that we know go over there and fight on it. But it's out of the area. So what do we see? We saw the terrain, we saw the tactics that were used, and how are they going to come into play in Palmito Ranch. Okay. You guys seen Three Amigos?
Yeah.
El Guaapo? Is it me, or does this guy look like him?
He does.
All right? And this is who I think they made El Guaapo after this guy, right? Juan Nepomuceno Cortina. Right? And you're thinking, oh, this guy's the bandit, man, the bandito, right? So his family, it was firstborn, he actually had a lot of land, Spanish land grants when Spain still owned it, so they owned the land. Well, when they went to America and they became American, half of his land was in America, some of his land was in Mexico. Oh, man, what are you gonna do? Well, guess what? These settlers keep coming onto his land. And they're like, well, this is Texas now, saying your land. We don't recognize the Spanish land grant. So then you start, hey, wait a second. So then you start going these legal battles. And how do you pay for legal battles, right? You sell off parts of your land. So his family ended up losing a lot of land to do this. He was getting angry. And he was like, man, these Mexicans who okayed this, the Anglos who came in, the Americans who pulled us in, I don't like any of you. So this guy was full of piss vinegar. He didn't like anyone, right? He was a rough guy. He'd walk in town. If you were a pro-American sheriff, he shot the sheriff of Brownsville, point blank, right in the streets. You know what I mean? And he was tough to catch. He'd rally his men, his family members, and people who lived there, and then they would dart across the river and go hide. Americans can't get me here. And then when Americans leave, he'd dart back into America and raid, and then go back. He was like guerrilla warfare back in a whole bunch of years that this guy did this thing, right? In fact, Robert E. Lee was sent down to Fort Brown to try and kill this guy, and he couldn't do it. You know what I mean? And guess what? Lee wasn't the first one who couldn't do it. Nobody could do it. This guy was pretty savvy. It was his territory, his land. He owned, he knew it really well, right? Okay. But regardless.
It's like Pancho Villa.
Yeah.
Years before, right?
Yeah, Pancho Villa was later on,
Yeah,
1915, yeah. But yeah, so the same tactics hit and run.
Same tactics, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? And this guy, he aced it. He knew how to do it. He did it against Robert E. Lee. He did it against the Texas Rangers. He did it during the Civil War, actually. You know what I mean? And then he finally got busted in 1870, and then he was free. But so when you imagine doing a Civil War, right? In the Civil War, and then you have this guy. He's a thorn in the mix that you can't calculate for, and he's just making your life hard because you never know. And this guy. Sometimes his allegiance is with this general in Mexico, and sometimes with this guy, and whoever's his friend. I mean, insane. But this was part of the dynamics of that time, 1865 in South Texas. Next slide. Okay, so we have the U.S. Civil War raging on, right? We have this guy, this bandit, going back and forth each time. Guess what? Mexico is going through a civil war at the exact same time. You have two Civil War countries sharing a border, right? So the Mexican, we have the U.S. and we seceded and do all that. In Mexico, they had what we call the conservatives, the guys who were actually pro-monarchy. They were like kings. They liked the Spanish kings and they liked that kind of stuff. And the liberals, this guy named Benito Juarez, was like, no, people need to govern themselves, and he took over. So we have a liberal, they called it liberal back in those days, liberal Mexican government, officially corresponding with the United States government, right? But here's the deal, and also they had, the conservatives had a lot of military forces all around, so you really had, can you imagine Richmond being co-located next to Washington, D.C.? This is how bad it was, and it was really rough, right? Well, remember I talked about the 1836 war against Texas? Mexico accrued a whole bunch of debt. And they were like, oh no, what are we gonna do? Benito Juarez, who took over, was like, hey, we're gonna do a 2-year moratorium where we're not paying anything to anyone because we can't afford it. We're hurting. Well, guess what? France, Spain, and England did not like that because they were owed money for fighting that war. So they're like, no, you don't get a chance to can you imagine? I'm not gonna pay my house payment for 2 years. You know what I mean? It doesn't work that way, right? So France is like, nah. So they get this dude from Austria, Maximilian. And they go, I'll tell you what, hey Maximilian, come on over here. Yeah, well, hey, we're kind of friends. Guess what? I'm gonna make you Emperor of Mexico. And they're like, but you're not really in charge of Mexico. Like, we have enough conservatives down there where we're going to call ourselves the rulers of Mexico.
Yeah.
So this guy, an Austrian, courtesy of France, gets installed to be the emperor of Mexico. What? Yeah, so he's out there, right? So he's running his part of the Civil War down there. Very crazy going on, all right? All right, next slide. Okay, that sets the background for what we're doing, right? So now let's go to the U.S. Civil War, right? The times that we like, right? That's what we're gonna do. So what was going on? 1861, now we'll go to 1863. Okay, why do we care about South Texas, man? You know what I mean? We're fighting all sorts of awesome battles all over the place. You know, we got the Shilohs, we got the Bull Runs, we got all these other big ones. He goes, oh yeah, well guess what? This river here and these steamboats you see, guess they can move up and down. Hey, you got a, what was that? Some blockade ships up there? Okay, I got an international port right here. So this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna take cotton from everywhere you want to in America. We're gonna smuggle it down to South Texas, and we're going to put it on ships. And this is kind of like mobster, right? This is kind of neat. They become friends with the Mexicans across the border, and they go, we're gonna put this cotton on your ships. We're gonna do all the paperwork in your name. You're going to run it out, and then we'll give you a cut. Okay. Merchants are like, yeah, that's money to me. I don't care. I don't care about your war. I'm just trying to, stay afloat here and get rich. So they did this from 1861 to 1863. The blockade was out 18 miles, right? So when these ships would leave, they would come out with a bill of lading, and they would have, 20 bales of cotton, for example, courtesy of Mexico. They're like, Mexico doesn't produce this much cotton. Like, well, yeah. What are you going to do about it? You're going to tell me I'm lying? Here's the paperwork that says it. Here's the stamps and everything from all the officials that say it. And they're all like, okay. So the Union blockade guys who were off the coast were frustrated. Those all get out because they knew it wasn't from Mexico. They knew it was from the Confederacy, but they could not make those accusations without international blowback, right? Because guess what? If they got Maximilian angry down there in Mexico City, he's from France. So he's going to go to France and go, hey, you don't want to participate in this U.S. Civil War. Guess what? They're stopping somebody's cotton, right? And then the France would get involved with the Confederacy. The U.S. did not want France involved with the Confederacy. They didn't want any international aid. So the U.S. the blockade runners were just angry, and they just let this cotton go. Well, guess what? The cash was rolling in, and this was bankrolling parts of the Confederacy, especially Edmund Kirby Smith's section right down there. So for 3 years, 2 or 3 years, it was just like mob. Like imagine no law and the mob was just going, right? This is what they were doing there. Okay, next slide. Great for the Confederacy, frustrating for the Union, right? So let me give you a couple more players.
I didn't know, but that was interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty. Santos Benitez. Another trivia point, he's the highest ranking Hispanic Confederate officer, colonel, right? There's an elementary school named for him up there, the Santos Benitez Elementary School in that part of the world. Regardless, he was the mayor of Laredo, okay? He wasn't just the mayor. He was a merchant, a rancher, right? He fiddled with slave catcher because he could just go into Mexico if any escaped slaves go in. He spoke English and Spanish, so he could just do everything. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of pull. He had influence. So this guy was like, he was the man when it came to anything in Laredo. So he pretty much owned the western part of the Rio Grande Valley. That was his baby. And nobody moved anything without his knowledge, right? So he kept that cotton trade going. Next slide. Now, that's the western part. This is the eastern part of the Rio Grande Valley. This guy, Colonel John Ford, nicknamed Rick, all right? South Carolinian, who wanted to escape his grandfathers were all in the American Revolution. He wanted to make a name for himself, so he came to Texas, right? Started new, and guess what? He hunches up a Texas Ranger unit. He fights some Indians. He kind of likes it. He's also a doctor. Back in those days, a lot of people were doctors. A lot of people were lawyers too. You know what I mean? He did all that. State representative. He had his own newspaper up in Austin, right? But this is what he liked doing. This paid the bills. But this is what he liked doing. So he became, so when the Civil War opened up, he volunteered, and everyone respected this guy because he'd also fought in the Mexican War. So he became a colonel. Now, why is he nicknamed Rip Ford? Well, the proper thing is to say that when some of his Rangers, because he went as a Texas Ranger leader in the Mexican War, when his Rangers got killed, he would sign, letters to the parents saying, "Hey, I'm sorry your son got killed, blah, blah, Rip Ford, rest in peace," and then Ford was his signature. That's the official one. The unofficial one, which has actually got a lot of evidence behind it, is because he contracted malaria back in the Mexican War early on, and he was taking quinine, I guess, to kind of help combat it, and it had a lot of issues, and it would make him fall asleep. In fact, there's instances and stories of him falling asleep in the saddle, and his people were like, "Hey, sir, wake up!" So they called him Rip, like Rip Van Winkle, But he was the man over in parts of East Texas. So he came down to Brownsville, right? He oversaw when the Confederacy had Fort Brown, and he made sure that cotton kept flowing down the river and the cash kept rolling in. But because he's bilingual, his wife, his second wife, I think, she was from Mexico, right? So he had relations back and forth. He was an unofficial ambassador. He would go across to the mayor of Matamoros and discuss terms of trade, things like that. And then the liberal and the conservative generals of Mexico who would take turns, he was friends with both of them. So this guy was the man in the eastern part of the Rio Grande Valley. All right? Very interesting character for sure. Next slide, please. Okay, well, 1863, Lincoln had enough. They finally realized, like, okay, these guys are bleeding us dry. They are just like, and they went by the blockade runners, you know what I mean? They knew the South was getting, so they're like, okay, we can't stop them going there, but we're gonna go ahead and put some forces in. So they actually landed 7,000 troops under Nathaniel Banks, and they came over and we're gonna clear out the Confederacy out of the Rio Grande Valley, right? Well, Rip Ford didn't have a lot of forces. General B, his superior at the time, who was officially in charge, didn't have a lot of forces to give him. So they said 1863, right, the height of the Civil War, right? The U.S. just really scored out a whole bunch of conscripts and a whole bunch of bodies, right? As the Confederacy couldn't do. So they took over. Union came in. This is them evacuating part of Fort Brown, taking it across the Matamoros, and there was actually about 200 bales of cotton, I think, that were burned, so the Union wouldn't take it. But the Union ended up putting all their men. They put pickets across the entire Rio Grande Valley, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Laredo, and they kind of squashed the Confederacy. The Confederacy just fizzled out. And for a year, it was kind of quiet. And well, guess what? Now they have a whole bunch of men down there. So Lincoln and his guys are like, okay, you guys aren't really doing anything. We squashed this. I need some of your people. So forces started ebbing, started going away. So as they were leaving, just like true guerrillas, the Confederate forces slowly came in behind them and then took it over again. All right? And they pushed them all the way back out to the Gulf of Mexico, to that Brazos Santiago area, which is right near the Gulf of Mexico. And the Confederates took over Fort Brown one more time again. Pretty much without a fight. You know what I mean? Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're fast forwarding, right? We're getting close to the battle, I promise you, right? What's the, here's one piece of trivia. When Santos Benitez, who never really left power out of Laredo, right? When the U.S. forces were there, they kind of left him alone. And he had to get really, really crafty with how he was sneaking his cotton. But let me just give a quick stat. For example, one time, right there in the city streets of Laredo, in the city center, he had 5,000 bales of cotton.
Wow.
So if you think about it, that's $756 and $945 per bale in 1865, right? That was between 3.8 and 4.7 million, billion dollars. I'm sorry, 3.7 million back in those days, which would be the equivalent of 78 to 97 billion dollars today.
Wow.
So he was sitting on almost $1 trillion worth of cotton there. But again, he owned the place, he had pickets everywhere, and Laredo's kind of far away, so if they wanted to mass anything, he could either hide it across the river, he could evacuate it, he could fight it, and he could make it fight. He could fight to the point where it was not worth the Union's worthwhile to pursue. So he sat there, 5,000 bales of cotton. That's pretty interesting. And that's the amount of volume of cotton that they were dealing with. Okay. All right, 1865, Texas was in very rough shape. In fact, the only semblance of a Confederate army was there in South Texas. Houston, Galveston, all those major ports and everything was like lawlessness. People, no joke, were rioting. Soldiers who fought in the Civil War came back. They hadn't gotten paid. They were kind of starting actually to riot because they wanted some pension or some pay. And they couldn't, in Texas, we can't afford this, right? In fact, the Texas governor, Murrah, petitioned Jefferson Davis saying, hey, can you send us back our troops so we could police our own cities? And Jefferson Davis kind of like took the easy way out. He goes, I'm not really in charge of those guys. General Lee is. He pushed that to General Lee. And General Lee is like, he's 1865, right? He's at Petersburg, just bleeding to death, you know what I mean? And he's like, I can't give you these guys. Sorry, my regrets. Get out of here. So Texas, what they had there, South Texas, and here's the sad part, it was really about 300 guys. You got guys who are on furlough, you got guys that are leaving and everything, it's really rough, but 500 troops would be the total number. Take the guys who were sick, the guys who were on leave, the guys who were slightly, just out a little bit, you really had a force of about 300 rifles that you could do there. So it was rough. Okay, but that's it. So here's a couple more. This is from Palmito Ranch, and you can see some of the pictures, flat. That's why I don't call it Palmito Hill. And then that's the scrub, Chaparral and Monte, they call it in Spanish. Okay, next slide.
Is that scrub shop? That's close to Palmito too, right? Or it's by Palmito too, right?
Yeah, this is from the Battle of Palmito Ranch. Palmito Ranch is actually, well, it's a whole other section which I'll get into, but yeah, that's what they would have encountered. What you see there in 2018 when the picture was taken was the same thing they would have in 1865. Okay, next slide. In fact, there were actually 5 major battles that were fought in Texas, and the only one that's deemed close to being what you would see is this one, because it's so pristine, still to this day, because it's just ranch land. It hasn't been developed, right? Okay, this guy, okay, so James Slaughter. Remember I mentioned Colonel Rip Ford was in charge of the troops down there at Fort Brown? He commanded the men. Slaughter was in overall command of the fort and the forces. So the way I like to say it is, this is like me, I'm the head of my house, and it's my house, right? My family, right? I'm the head. But my wife is really in charge. She's kind of like Rip Ford. She's in charge of the day-to-day troops of the kids and stuff like that. So who's really in charge? Rip Ford or this guy, James Slaughter, right? They actually had a pretty decent relationship all the way up until after the Battle of Palmito Ranch, and they got along well. The men respected Ford. They knew him. He was a fighter, right? He was one of them. He's stationed with them. They know him. They really didn't know too much about James Slaughter, so they really didn't care. But he's a general. He's a colonel. Rip should have been a general, but his paperwork was held up, and I think they held it up so that this guy would have a command. Can you imagine having a brigade commander with only one regiment with only one battalion with only one company with one platoon? That's kind of how it was, because everyone was hurt. Okay, next slide. I'll go next slide. Okay, so this guy's really cool. Lew Wallace, right? You guys been up to Shiloh, right? He kind of got the black eye. He got blamed, and they found out later on that it really wasn't Lew Wallace's fault, right? And Grant kind of like ate some crow after publicly bashing him. Regardless, Fort Donelson, he pretty much saved the Union at points Fort Donelson. That's why he became the youngest two-star general, right? And then he actually saved a little bit of Washington, D.C. when, was it A.P. Hill or Ewell was up there threatening it, Monocacy, yeah, and he delayed him and pushed him away, and he pretty much saved Washington, D.C., so he's kind of underrated in my opinion. He's actually really cool though too, because after the war, he wrote Ben-Hur. He's the author of Ben-Hur. Yeah. He was also the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and then he was the governor of New Mexico eventually. And funny enough, funny as this is, right, in his play here with Mexico, he actually became a Mexican major general after the war. Wow. right? When the Civil War was over. So they needed some true soldiers, so he was actually dead. So very interesting guy. Regardless, okay, back to Lew Wallace. He's on Grant's staff up in DC area, City Point, and he starts thinking, he's like, man, this war's over. We know it's over. It's inevitable. It's coming down. What we don't want to happen is this war to become a guerrilla war. We don't want Confederates fleeing across into Mexico and then pulling a Cortina, right, going back and forth, and we stretch this war out even longer. So he talked to Grant. He said, hey, send me down there. I want to make peace with those guys, and I want to stop it so we don't have to do this. So Grant said, approved, go. So he went down over to Point Isabel in Brazos, Santiago, and he was an unofficial ambassador, but he was also the senior guy in that area. And on March 11th, he actually met with Slaughter and Ford, and he said, gentlemen, let's be realistic. The war's going to end. You know what I mean? It's over. But we don't want this. Let's not do this. Let's come up with terms of surrender that we can do that makes sense. And Slaughter and Ford both agreed. They knew the war was over. And especially Ford did not want Texas, which was already in shambles, you know what I mean, to be the ground where this guerrilla warfare happened. He just didn't want it. So they all agreed. They said, I'll tell you what. And he actually had very, very good terms of surrender. You have to take an oath of allegiance to the U.S. when you're done. But if you really don't want to do that, you're free to go to Mexico, and we won't stop you. You can go whatever. Just we're gonna be cool about this. So Ford and Slaughter were like, this is very good. We like these terms. This is good. But then they realized that he did not have the authority, and Slaughter did not have the authority to come up with terms of surrender. You know what I mean? They had to go up one more level in their chain of command to approve it. Yeah. So they walked away, shook hands, gentleman's agreement, saying, hey, no more fighting down here. And everybody relax, talk to your men. And when we get this officially, then you guys can walk across to Mexico. You can take an oath of allegiance. You can go home. We really don't care. They said everything sounds good. So from March 11th over until the battle happened, it was a very laid back, peaceful way. Next slide. Okay, you guys seen Glory, right? Matthew Broderick's character goes from lieutenant, I think, to colonel. Yeah. And he gets placed in charge of a regiment of U.S. colored troops. This was this guy. He went from second lieutenant to colonel, and he was offered 62nd U.S. colored troop regiment. He had no experience, right? Well, guess what? The colored troops at this time were filled up in Brazos, Santiago, but they weren't doing anything because remember Lew Wallace said everybody just relax. So they just did garrison duty there. And it's hot, let me tell you something. Yeah, well, it's cold and rainy at some points, but in this case it was getting kind of hot in South Texas, right? And this guy had no action. He was on, so he had nothing. The Civil War was coming to an end, and he had zero conflicts. He had nothing. He had nothing under his belt, right? So just remember that when you think about it. He was a senior guy on deck there at Brazos, Santiago when the battle kicked off, and he was okay. Next slide. Okay. So for some reason, and we'll get into why he did this in a little bit, but evening of May 11th, or morning of May 12th, however you want to look at it, he wanted to go across this way, go through here, but there was a rainstorm and it was flooded, so he ended up actually coming this way. He actually didn't do it. He had his Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, his subordinate, take about 250 U.S. troops, the 34th Indiana, the U.S. colored troop, portion of the 34th of the U.S. colored troops. And he started coming down this way. Well, it was bad, and they actually ended up camping here, right over here, because the weather was bad. It was so late. They wanted to get some sleep. All right. Next slide. Okay. So the morning of May 12th, he was here, and they start moving their forces this way. Of course, over here on the Mexican side of the river, there were a lot of Mexican troops, and they saw, well, why are there Union troops here? They should all be hanging out over here at Brazos, Santiago. Why are they up here? And why are they moving this way? It doesn't make sense. So the Mexicans, they ran back over to Brownsville, and they told everybody, hey man, the U.S. troops are on the move. And it freaked everybody out because they were not expecting that, right? So they're like, wait a second, since March, all we've been doing is relaxing, chilling, drinking beer, playing cards, and waiting, right? So this is kind of interesting. Confederates had some pickets out here, and on the afternoon of May 12th, the pickets were engaged. Pickets fell back. Pickets got word back to Colonel Ford, who was over here in Brownsville. And they told them, hey, the Union guys are advancing and our pickets are giving way. You know, we have no choice, that it's a superior force. The Union troops were actually reinforced by 300 more men, so they had about a total force of about 500 men going through there. It's not Shiloh numbers, I got it. But for compared to 0, it was interesting to see a sea of blue, right? Whoa, Ford's like, oh my gosh, what? They're on the roof? What the heck? This is not supposed to happen. Hey, sound like you get the bell, ding, 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 everybody get up here, right? Well, guess what, you know, Johnny's in town with Susie, you know what I mean? He's relaxing over here. He's got a little side business, you know, blacksmithing over here, and you need to tell everybody, get back here, this is real. So the Confederate forces were like, what? They slowly started to assemble and filter back to Brownsville. Remember, I told you they were in bad shape back in those days, right? They were already thinking of the next chapter after the war. Yeah. So they were like, oh crap. Okay, next slide. So he did that in the afternoon of May 12th. At this point, the Confederates had sort of kind of reinforced some of their picket positions, but they were still falling back, but they had slowed them down a little bit. Okay, next slide. There we go. Okay, so finally, he was told the afternoon of the day before, he left Brownsville with his troops and cannon and horses at around 10 o'clock in the morning, and then he finally got here at around 4 p.m. That's a slow movement. That's not really far. I mean, that's 6 miles or something like that. And Forest Mars, I mean, whatever. It just shows to show you that these guys were not really prepared or really, is this real? You know what I mean? Yeah, it was real. And they moved them up. Now, the good news is that when they got there, Rip Ford knew what was going on. He was pretty smart. So he took his men, he split them into 2, and he said, we're going to attack them here, engage them here, and we're going to have another force come around this way and push them on the side of their flank here. Well, with the river on one side, they had no other way to go. And he was thinking, this is going to make them surrender. Sure enough, Rip Ford came out, high chaparral, and he put all his horses to go around. He had his men here, and he had cannon going, flying artillery, moving up and getting ready to advance on these guys. The Union had only infantry. They had no cavalry. They had no mobile cannon. They had nothing. And I think they thought, this is my opinion, they thought it was going to be a cakewalk. Those guys were gone. We're just going to cruise in, right? Regardless, they ended up getting beat. They beat down. The Confederates engaged with them. They said, you want to do this? Okay, we're going to do this, right? So they hit them hard, and the U.S. troops started fleeing. And there were some reports that they actually tried to go across the river, and they were killed by Mexicans on the other side. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds great, right? Sounds like a good story. All right, so then they fled on the afternoon of May 13th. So again? Yeah, so they ran back. So they were pursued, and they were trying to deploy pickets on their rear guard to cover the rest of their retreat. But it weren't too good because they were pursued by guys on horses. You know what I mean? You're a foot soldier, untrained foot soldier with no combat experience. Here comes 20 horses coming at you. I'm picking up my rifle, my little one-shot rifle, and I'm leaving. All right, they all booked. Okay, next slide. See if it goes. Okay, go back to one more. I'm sorry. Yeah, so about here, they actually stopped the pursuit. These guys were running, like literally sprinting to get back to survive. There was actually some Union ships who were here who were shooting to give them some kind of naval support. And when they started seeing some naval bombardment happen in between the two forces, the Confederacy was like, okay, we drove them back 5 miles. I think we won. All right, we can stop this pursuit. In fact, Colonel Ford was like, our horses are tired, we need to feed them. And Slaughter was like, let's go. And Ford's like, no, we're not going to do that. So they stopped, right? Ford was really in charge. Remember my wife and me? All right. Okay, next slide.
I heard that.
Yeah. So who's this guy, right? John Jefferson Williams. He was the last official casualty. He was killed there at the Battle of Palmetto Rancho on May 13th. So, yeah. So now you ask yourself, well, why did this guy have to die? What was so important about it? What were they doing? And why did Barrett leave the chilling confines of Brazos Santiago to go over there? Why did he even do this? Well, there's a couple theories. Theory number one is he was looking for some excitement, some glory, and something to put under his belt. Because he thought it was going to be a win. He thought, I'm going to easily win, and we're going to be the victors, and I'm going to get a little bit of prestige amongst the officers of the Oak Globe, right? Yeah. Wrong. he failed to take into consideration the steadfastness of Rip Ford. And Rip Ford had made an oath to his men that he was going to, on my honor as a man, that we will defend this. Barrett didn't know that. Oops, right? Second theory they come out with is, and it's kind of weak, is he actually had, and I'm sad to admit this, but he had a small number of Texans that joined the Union, unmounted cavalry, and he was going to town to get them horses. I don't know, that's a weak theory in my opinion, right? It wasn't even a full company, it was like a smidgen of guys. Okay, the third theory is he wanted to take Fort Brown, he wanted to confiscate the cotton that was in there so that he'd be hailed a hero as he just pushed the Confederates out of Fort Brown. He apprehended all this cotton, all this contraband, and he, made the Union so many millions of dollars of what they could do. No, I can kind of see that, right? But it goes along with the personal glory and the arrogance, in my opinion. Makes sense. Now, why were the Confederates even there? Well, I'll tell you what, like I said, the end of the war was coming. They had a lot of cotton stockpiled there at Fort Brown, and they were trying to get the stuff out the river, trying to get it across, and they're like, we need to stay here until all this is gone, so the Union's not tempted to come in here. So that's why they think it was there. Okay, next slide. All right. Here's an example of the battle. You can see the U.S. troops, total about 500 strength, and on May 13th when they start doing it, this is kind of dramatized, it was probably a little more separated than one massive force of 500. But you can see the Confederacy here, and you can see the second prong of the end around, as the cavalry came in to attack these guys. The river would be here, but that's kind of what it looked like. But look at that, about 300 Confederate soldiers, against 500. They say 800, but really probably 600 to 700 really U.S. soldiers there. This is kind of interesting. They had 0 killed from the Confederacy, 7 wounded. It's pretty impressive. You know what I mean? Of course, they were not fighting against veterans. They were fighting against newbies. You know what I mean? Probably a little nervous. This is their first engagement. Shots are a little wild, right? But it is what it is.
I know some of the U.S. either killed or drowned. Drowned the river.
Yeah, they say killed, but how many fleed into the river? They don't have a good number. So they just lumped the guys who drowned as killed as part of it. Because it was a direct result of the engagement. But yeah. But 113 prisoners. Remember I was telling you how they were advancing on those pickets as the pickets were leaving? Horses run a little faster than Union, than the infantry, so they were able to catch a lot of prisoners. Any question? Okay, yeah. So it was a win for the Confederacy, and it was a blowout to the Union. It was an embarrassment to the Union, right? Regardless, May 26th, remember it was May 13th when it happened, Slaughter fled to Mexico. He knew the end was coming, he wanted to go across. Now, remember I told you Ford and Slaughter were kind of amenable and friends? Slaughter kind of crossed Ford here. Slaughter ended up selling some of those cannon to the Mexicans and for 20,000 pesos, and he pocketed it, right? And Ford found out about it. And Ford pulled a Nathan Bedford Force and came up with a gun and said, nope, you're not taking that money. I haven't gotten paid in a year. I'm going to take my money, and I'm going to take this much amount of money for all my men who haven't gotten paid for 6 or 7 months. You're going to give it to me, I'm going to disperse it to my men, and then I'll give you a little bit of money you can take. And Slaughter gave it to him. You know what I mean? So, the Texas version of Nathan Bedford Force, right? And then, of course, CSA evacuated Fort Brown May 29th. They had to get all the cotton out of there by then. So, from May 12th to May 29th, they're hustling cotton out as fast as they can. As soon as the cotton was out, the CSA, Confederate forces left it. So, I.F. Ford fled to Mexico right after the last cotton bale was put on shipping and left. He didn't flee, he just walked across the border to his wife and kids and his friends. You know what I mean? And he just hung out there until the U.S. came back and said, hey, you can come back. You know what I mean? He didn't care. And then, of course, we talked about the TransMississippi surrender. That was the forces up there in Galveston by General Edmund Kirby Smith. That was the big one. That was the actual surrender that happened, right? Of course, they realized this, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of hard feeling to all these surrenders. And Sheridan actually came down with 50,000 troops and made a wall of blue across the Rio Grande Valley because they did not want that guerrilla warfare thing to happen like Lew Wallace was trying to prevent. So they did it, right? Colonel Barrett, actually, who was so embarrassed, he actually put a blame on his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, and had him try to be brought up on charges. doing bad things and everything like that. Total fabrication and lies to put blame on some other guy. In fact, his subordinate. I mean, how distasteful is that, right? Regardless, there were enough witnesses to survive. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was acquitted, and Barrett had his hand slapped and got out. All right, but this is the brush area. You can see one more time. Last thing. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's it for the battle. Small number of forces, actually inconsequential to the outcome of the war. It didn't really do anything, and it was a Confederate victory. All right, so this is what you see on the battlefield today. That sign, if you're able to peek across in here. This is one of the roads. This is what you see from the battlefield. This is all you can do. Private property, you can't go in there. So this is all you get. You can go turn up a radio in the radio station. There's little things, and you can just listen to a little story about Rick Ford and all those guys, fighting it.
Is that marker at this side? Is that what you see on the left side?
No,
of the
this
picture?
this marker is actually just past. There's a fence right here. You can
Right
see.
there?
It's just past the fence. You can't really even see it unless you have permission to go in there. But this is the only state marker you can see. Something talks about the actual battle.
So private property.
It's private property. In fact, this is kind of an ironic twist that I found out is the Uribe family, who now owns this land, married into my family's, actually no. My family came across from Italy very poor, the champions, like Campione family, and they married into the Fernandez and the Uribe families to get land. That's how my family got land, right? They married, in fact, 4 brothers married 4 sisters, kind of unique, right? But once they had land, they became the founders of Brownsville, Port Isabel, and everything is actually some of my family members, distant family members. So the folks who own this land where cattle are still grazed to this day are distant family members from my family. But it's part of the bird corridor, comes from Mexico. Birds go across, they migrate, migrate in the winter, they go south for Mexico and everything. They go through this area. So birding is fantastic. If you guys are birders, you can see green jays, you can see whatever. Texas ocelot, not a leopard, not a panther, it's an ocelot, it's kind of weird. It's one of the only places it's being driven out of Mexico, and they live there in South Texas. Next slide. But that's it, there's nothing out there, very well preserved. This is, today, obviously, this is Brownsville, Texas. That's not an everyday picture, okay, that's Charro Days, it's a celebration. Everyone thinks you're from Texas, everyone walk around on horses. I'm like, no, not for a while, right? But Charro Days festivals. This is part of what's left of Fort Brown. Fort Brown was actually made, it was reinforced by Sherman, it was done through World War II, and it grew, and eventually they closed it all down, and they gave it or sold it for like $1 to the university. So University of Texas Brownsville sits on where Fort Brown is. And this is, you can't see it, but it says A.A. Champion Hall. He's one of my Campione family, Champion family folks, who is a historian for this area. This was actually the World War II. This was, just before World War II. This was a hospital area section. Okay.
Is that about all that's left of the fort?
Yes, the fort you can't even see. You can't see any depressions. You can't see any mounds. It's all gone. There's a golf course right nearby.
What is that building to the right of in the background?
This?
No,
Okay.
behind the building. There.
Yeah, these are university buildings.
So
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, and this is original to the 1920s portion of the fort. You can see it's it was a barracks back in the 1920s, and now it's then it was a morgue, and then now it's one of the county historical society buildings that they leased from the university.
Well, that's good.
And then of course one of the top zoos in the country is down there as well. Next slide. That's the Brownsville area. South Padre Island, obviously. Yeah. Remember the old Brazos Santiago looked like this? Oh, there's nothing there, and now it's a huge resort area. Okay, next slide. And then this is Brazos Santiago. This is where the Union forces were camped. There's nothing there anymore. Oh. You can't go out there. It's natural. It's a national wildlife refuge, theoretically. But yeah, you can. I'm not fishing out here though. You can go fishing out here. But SpaceX, Starship 9. You guys may have heard some of those launches. Yeah. Starship launching from Texas. Like what? Why is it launching from Texas, not Cape Canaveral? Well, this is why. They can launch out of here and you go over the water just like they do. Plus, it's a lower latitude, whereas if you put anything in orbit, you're confined to that plane, depending on the latitude that you launch at. And you always usually want to try and get as south as you can to get a lot of coverage. So Texas is actually further south than Cape Canaveral. So that's why they launch out of here, because they can get a lot more stuff. Plus, Elon Musk bought up a whole bunch of this land so they can shoot rockets. So, in fact, this is an artist rendering of the spaceship, Starship 9. In fact, you can watch the videos. It comes up, it went up really high, it came down. That's the one that Elon Musk wants to send to Mars. It's supposed to land on Mars and then come back. Okay, there it goes. Next one.
What's that little blue markers to the left of the red?
This?
Yeah, that one.
This is the building area. This is what you see here.
Oh,
The assembly area.
that's the launch.
And this is the launch pad, launch and recovery pads.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
But again, there's the jetties here, South Padre Island. The Rio Grande River would be about right there. Okay. Yep, you guys like right there. Okay, one more. All right, so this is actually my
All right.
third cousin, Eugene Fernandez. He's the Cameron County Historical Commission guy. And he's doing a special with the local news at Palmito Ranch. Obviously some of the scrubs out there, but you get the idea. All right. Any questions on the tiny little insignificant, but rather interesting international flare battle at Palmito Ranch?
Yeah, Michael, the Confederate soldiers who left at the fort after the battle, how many of those surrendered, how many went to Mexico?
Gone, fizzled out, went away.
Did they go to Mexico or did
Some did, the officers did, and some of the enlisted who had wives and girlfriends went, but then a lot of them went back up. I mean, they went pretty much without any kind of harassment or anything after the war, because again, there was not a lot of Union forces down there until Sherman came in at the end to reinforce us, so they just walked home.
Okay.
And like I said, they only had 300, really, so not too many.
So they didn't sign an official oath of allegiance or anything like that?
They may have later on at their home, but not there. They were gone. Take it back. The guys who did go across did come back across to sign at the end, but everybody else just.
And I wonder if a lot of them know Joe Shelby went down there and a lot of them joined Maximilian.
Yes,
And I don't know if any of these guys did.
they may have. And the Maximilian was kind of, like I said, Lew Wallace actually went down there after the war
Yeah.
because Mexico was looking for professional soldiers who had experience. We got a lot of that, you know. Anybody else?
Didn't Texas have telegraph back then to let them know the war was over?
Yeah. Like I said, they knew the war was over. You know, the war. Now I will say this: has anyone ever been down there to South Texas? Anybody?
Yeah,
McAllen? Did you fly into there or did you drive?
I drove.
You drove. Okay, so you know that stretch from Houston, 5 hours is a lot of nothing. You know what I mean? Well, you got the little city of Victoria, you got Corpus Christi, but it's the King Ranch. In fact, just north of that area is the King Ranch, which is the largest ranch in America. You know what I mean? And so you drive right through the King Ranch and you see cows and stuff like that, but that's about it. So, yeah, so word was there. They knew. And that's why it comes back to Colonel Barry. Why did he leave? And it has to be personal ego, you know? And Ford did his duty, saying, the war is not over. We have not officially, surrendered. We have not made a truce officially. So I have to, by my own integrity, defend what we were told to do. For him to have said, the Union's coming, let's just go away, would have been an insult to him. If you ever read anything about Ford too, he was very, very big on that. Very big on honoring his ancestors and those kind of things. So there's no way. Plus, some people say that Ford had made a statement earlier. Ford owned no slaves, but Ford was very pro-slavery, as most people were. And he told his men that there was be no way that he would ever surrender his command to slaves, mongrels, Asians, very derogatory words to a lot of people. So when the U.S. colored troops were the ones that were advancing, kind of makes you wonder, what was Ford thinking? Was he really just going to allow the U.S. colored troops to take Fort Brown under his watch? I have a feeling he would have done it if they were white troops, but he definitely wasn't going to do it for colored troops, So, very interesting thing about Ford, but yeah. And it was funny because part of the informal truce that Wallace had, remember I talked about, they had to sign an allegiance, or they could leave. It was also, they had also agreed upon terms of gradual emancipation for any slaves that were there, which is kind of neat. You don't hear a lot about emancipation of slaves during surrendering, but it was thought of and voiced and discussed. It's pretty interesting. And apparently Rip Ford did not have a problem with that. You know what I mean? He knew that slavery was on the downhill. But interesting. Very interesting character if you ever want to read up on Rip Ford.
Michael, that was great.
Okay.
Thank you.